Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Palmer McIntyre. I am the director for the Great Trail State Coalition. Welcome to our Cities, Towns, and Counties for Trails webinar. Today, we have a really important, timely topic, resilient and sustainable trail infrastructure from those who are living through a very challenging time for the post-Hurricane Helene. So we have Lucy Crown with the City of Asheville and Kimberly Williams with Alta Planning and Design. I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit more in detail after I go through just a couple of introductory slides about the coalition itself. I hope you all are familiar with what the coalition does, but want to, hang on. There we go. Want to acknowledge all of the coalition members. We have about 130 members. Our mission is focused on securing sustained state funding for trails and trail-friendly policies across the state of North Carolina so all 100 counties can enjoy the benefits that trails provide. So we greatly appreciate the membership support from all of these nonprofits, local government, and industry partners. And just to recap the success we've had since we formed in 2020, the Year of the Trail campaign, but also over $60 million in funding for trails. This includes the Complete the Trails Fund for authorized state trails and also the Great Trail State Program, $25 million of non-recurring funding in 2023, and the Great Trail State Day designation. We've been celebrating the Great Trail State Program announcements that these grants, $25 million, were distributed across the state for all phases of trail life cycles. So we are looking forward to showing the positive impacts and benefits these trail projects will deliver to communities of all sizes across the state. So the General Assembly recognizes that the Great Trail State Program is a good investment for all of North Carolina, and we can have future rounds. But we have an exciting array of projects across North Carolina in all regions, and we have an interactive map on our website that I'll pop into the chat later so you can see. We have some upcoming webinars. November 5th, we'll be talking about best practices for designing a greenway. So it's really the nuts and bolts with our friends at McAdams. And then we'll have a paddle trail webinar on December 2nd with some of our partners across the state involved with paddle trails. We'll put that in the chat too. And just to make a plug for the Great Trail State Conference, our second statewide conference is coming up August 10th through 12th in Winston-Salem. So you'll see more of that coming soon. So that concludes my part, and I hope that everyone had a great Great Trail State Day and found your way outside. We were super excited about all the engagement across the state. So I'll let Lucy and Kimberly go ahead and introduce yourselves, and you can start. Thank you.
All right, I'll maybe start because we have an actual introduction slide. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Palmer and team, for having us. Everyone see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let me try again. Yeah, so this is a presentation that Lucy and I actually did at the International Trails Conference in Madison. I think got a good response. And I'm Kimberly Williams with Alta Planning and Design based out of Asheville, our Asheville office. And I'm a senior designer and planner, and I've worked in trails for almost 20 years. And then I'll let Lucy introduce herself. Oh, Lucy, you're on mute.
You know, that's the story of my life. I'm Lucy Crown. I'm the transportation planning manager at the City of Asheville, but I first and foremost am a greenway planner. I've been one for about 20 years, both at the City of Asheville and before that, Buncombe County. And I'm really happy to be here with Kim to talk about what we have done, the City of Asheville's done since Helene and our recovery plan.
Great. You know, as Palmer mentioned, we both have lived in Asheville during Helene, and actually, you know, I've seen quite a bit of other damaging natural events. So while this, is largely going to talk about flooding, we'll also, I think, touch upon another, climate resiliency type events that you might be thinking about in planning and design and management. So a little bit about Alta. We really are trying to lead the way in resilient design and have a lot of experience all over the US doing this, but this is overall a lot of different things we do related to active transportation, but are definitely known for our trails work. The reason why I mentioned to you our broader mission is that we also work all over the country and have multiple offices, and this is where some of our offices are. And because we share a lot across offices what's going on, we are learning from each other how communities are facing climate change and disasters, and how we can better plan and design trails related to that. And so almost creating a practice around building and designing better resilient trails. And we also advise a lot on management and maintenance, which is a big part of that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about case studies today, but some of them are very specific to North Carolina, and a lot are going to be other natural conditions. So this is a little bit about the French Broad and Asheville, but we're going to step back and talk about their 4 pillars to really building resilient trails. And the first is the actual, trail pathway itself and making sure that that's resilient. It's also about the larger landscape around the trail being resilient and how we can plan and design for that. It's about resiliency for the trail users themselves in climate change and what they're dealing with as a user and experiencing the trail, and then the greater community resilience and how that also relates to trails. One thing I'm going to put a couple of plugs in here because there's a lot of evolving work around trail resiliency. There's a couple really good guides I'll point you to if you want to take a snapshot with your phone or a screenshot. There is this guide about trails as resilient infrastructure with some case studies, including some of Alta's work. And it really gets into the nitty-gritty. So this is kind of a high-level primer, this presentation, but the nitty-gritty, if you want to get into it, is in this book. And just a sneak peek of what some of the outline of that guide is. So I'm gonna get a little bit into case studies that focus on these different categories. I mentioned the 4 pillars of resilience with a special focus on North Carolina. So first of all, resilience in trails, it's really about, the trail itself and looking at what are all the things that we need to be considering. And, climate change, really it's about extreme heat. So that's relating to users and their experience, droughts and wildfires, severe storms and flooding, sea level rise in our coastal areas. And then it's about transportation and recreation impacts. So really wildfire damage is a big one that we don't think about as much, but probably will more and more in this state. And then trail roadway washouts and systems being compromised. So the first component of one of these pillars is about trail resilience. And here's a screenshot or a snippet of a photo I took from, if you've been to the New Belgium Brewing in Asheville, this is looking to the other side. And the Wilma Dykeman Greenway and some of the washout greenway, we lost about 20 to 30 feet of our bank. Trail resilience principles. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about, the higher level planning and things you should be considering in the planning stage. So, assessing at the planning level, and I think as a whole, we want to start incorporating resiliency into more of our planning documents, whether it's larger regional plans or, corridor plans, but thinking through these things as we're doing the planning and design. And, from the planning perspective, you can start identifying what are the buffers that you really need to have a good setback. Incorporating green infrastructure, sometimes this seems like the extra fluff if you can find a grant, but I think especially in the case of Asheville, on the Wilma Dykeman and otherwise, a lot of the green infrastructure that was installed, maybe not during Helene, but other rain and flood events has really captured a lot of stormwater before it gets into the rivers, preventing flooding from downstream. So if we can get a lot of our corridors to just be loaded with green infrastructure, that's going to reduce flooding. So there's a lot of different types of green infrastructure. I'm not going to go into a lot of that, but if you guys have questions, you can ask about that. Know what historically floods and doesn't. So our floodway and floodplain maps are no longer, completely valid. A lot of them are being remapped. Those are really wildly changing in a lot of ways. So knowing that is the minimum, but knowing historic flooding is important. And citing the trail related to that. And then account for trail hydro impacts. So this is probably, to me, the most aha moment in just, driving around a lot and seeing the greenway damage that happened. Probably one of the biggest impacts I see is just where there was convergence of waters is where the greatest destruction was for trails. So you had, stuff pounding and hitting into it, and it's not just water, we're talking whole houses, massive forces coming to play. And that's where you saw, total destruction of some of our trails. In other places you saw, the asphalt just lifting and moving. But where there was convergence, I think that's where it takes probably extra planning and design considerations to make sure that you're building a super resilient, probably much more expensive version of a trail. Some other planning considerations while looking at trail resiliency, and this is really for those communities that are dealing with a lot of flooding, like Haywood County and Canton, which has seen numerous flood events that have been pretty devastating, is working with the county and FEMA, who are often after flood events looking where there's going to be mitigation buyouts. And currently this program still is ongoing. Buncombe counties and the cities of Asheville is looking at it a lot right now. But something to consider as trail planners is these mitigation buyouts are great opportunities for you to coordinate with them about where trails have been planned. And so when these lands are being bought up, that you can make sure they're accommodating for recreation access. Quite often these lands are turned over to local counties or municipalities. And I'll give a little more guidance on that and some resources you can go to if this isn't something you're very familiar with. I think all trail planners should kind of start knowing more about this information. So knowing, what's going on with the buyout strategy and getting ahead of that is really important. So examples of some of this planning work that is currently happening. Again, here's I just wanted to show you too where the high water mark was for the French Broad River in the River Arts District. So, pretty significant impacts. But going back to Haywood County, we have Clyde, which is just east of Canton, west of Waynesville, east of Waynesville. In Clyde, they have had so many flooding impacts that a lot of their town is actually being turned over to mitigation buyouts. And in some way displacing their town because they currently people can't live there anymore because the floods are happening so frequently that they're willing to vacate. So a part of what Clyde is right now doing is re-envisioning what their community might look like if so many of their lands are being bought out for open space. And so something that Alta has been working with the town as part of the regional trails plan we did for Haywood County. We looked at what does it look like to redevelop and really activate both the Blueway and trail system to help that become part of their economy. And so, working, and one thing I will mention is a lot of these properties that are shown in green were bought out through also local state funds, which are a lot more restrictive if you don't get in front of them and have a negotiated allowance for trails or other recreation amenities. Oftentimes they don't want impervious surface. So it's really important, again, to start working with folks who are doing these buyout programs. Land trusts also were involved in this. We have a full chapter dedicated in our Haywood County Greenway plan to recommendations for open space management and flood mitigation planning. And it's was written by Gavin Smith, who's one of the nation's experts on that. And he's based out of NC State. So it's a really useful, very Greenway specific guide. But Gavin and a bunch of team members from NC State, including somebody that we just hired at Alta, were involved in this larger open space management guide that applies to the whole nation. But it's really step-by-step process of once your community is floods and you start looking at doing mitigation buyouts, what do you need to be considering for open space as you're buying out these properties. The next thing I'll mention is during the design phase of trails is really about resilient design. So some of this is a little bit of lingo and I'll explain it. Climate positive design is really about reducing the amount of carbon that you're using during the construction and selection of materials. So it's a much bigger conversation you need to have with your designers, but there is both engineers and landscape architects are trained in how to do this. There's a lot of cutting edge materials, everything from carbon neutral concrete. We have a whole presentation on carbon neutral trail design. So there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do there. For landscape architecture, there's something called CITES, which is kind of like LEED certification. And that is also really looking to aim, at reducing carbon so that we're designing things that don't actually have more of an impact. Designing for riparian buffers and green infrastructure, I would say this is, from year to year, probably one of the more important things you can do. And something I also saw within Western North Carolina with trails is trails that are too close to rivers will eventually have bank failure and you'll have to move trails back. So trying to give yourself as much of an adequate buffer as you can. And using resilient materials and surfaces in design. So sometimes they're more expensive. For example, a lot of the times concrete trails are built in floodplains, especially floodways, and they do tend to stand up more over time. I think in general, Lucy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the concrete trail that was built along the French Broad did fare pretty well. And another is to design culverts appropriate for projected flows. Sometimes it's more expensive to design for bigger culverts, but in the long run, it might help you reduce flooding and backing up of flooding. Install removable railings on bridges where flooding is anticipated. So oftentimes just debris flows can back things up, and thinking about removability. A lot of this is really focused on flooding, but fire-wise design is another big one, and I can touch a little bit on that. Here's another example for a project I worked on the French Broad Greenway, also on the New Belgium campus. And something related to green infrastructure as example is the city, New Belgium, and a lot of other partners decided to take this buried culvert creek, daylight it, and it allows for when there are flood events, the water backflows up into this channel. And I think while there was a lot of sediment deposited on the trail, which is basically where the view is taken from, it did allow for it to kind of calm the waters there. And even though I mentioned where the confluence happens, this is in one case where it actually became a backwater situation and the waters were calmer. So I think in a way it did help protect the trail. There's another example of that trail, and love, shout out to Greenworks and a lot of other community organizations who just had people come from all of the US to come help. I met somebody who drove down for the day from another state just to help do a trail cleanup. There's another example of some work, a trailhead that I helped design, and some of the flow that happened, and because we had really resilient, materials like steel, concrete, things survived fairly well. You can see it in the right-hand corner underwater. And then lastly, designing for emergencies. There's a lot you can do. This is a state park trail plan we did, but to ensure for when there are emergencies that you know, flood events, fire events, that you are designating trails with your emergency response system and identifying evacuation routes within your trail system. So that's another thing to consider in design. Landscape resilience is another thing, and I'll try to kind of speed up, Lucy, so we're giving you a little more time. Landscape resilience is about the larger landscape and ensuring for, you know, you're protecting ecological corridors that allow for water to happen, you know, to flood and fill up the floodplain on occasion. And really about making conservation as the main goal of a lot of our trails, and so that we can, you know, help our natural systems do what they need to do, whether it's, you know, flooding or otherwise. This is an example of a project that Alta worked on in Oregon, where a whole corridor for many, many, many miles burned over in an extreme fire. And Alta was asked to come in and develop a management plan on how to readapt the trail and lessons learned. And one of the biggest lessons learned is just that trail management is actually one of the biggest things you can do for to protect your trails during major events. This corridor had become really rife with an invasive things like a Chinese blackberry, and it was highly explosive and combustible with fire. And because it wasn't maintained, you know, that well as a corridor, and invasives came in, it burned over. But it also, in some ways, helped, you know, protect certain communities. So I think it's really learning on how to adapt management, and you know, this was going through multiple jurisdictions, and they faced the same issue. So they decided where they didn't have burnovers that they were going to better manage collectively as a group. So Alta helped a little bit with identifying management strategies from an ecological perspective. And then another project we did in Austin was just really about planning for ecological corridors that could be resilient and protect drinking water supply, and doing a lot of, you know, planning related to rapid urbanization and where are the most important ecosystem services to protect, so that during, you know, like climate change, these are the areas that are going to become the most critical for water supply and otherwise. And then lastly, I'll touch on user resilience, and that's really about, in climate change, how much more uncomfortable our trail spaces are going to become, and making sure that we're providing places that are comfortable and water and wayfinding in times of extreme weather. And this is an example of the LA River Path. We worked on a project to put a pathway basically along this wash, trying to figure out how to make it a more hospitable place in a pretty barren environment. And so Alta did a lot of analysis around designing for comfort and the level of shade, and what areas got shade and didn't, and where shade needed to be improved. And that became a big part of the design challenges, is how to improve the level of comfort for users. This is just some examples of the analysis. Actually, this is the last, I think, pillar. So it's community resilience is also about using trails at times of natural disasters. So actually, there's a lot of communities that use their trails as evacuation routes. I know in Asheville, we were immobile for almost a week, couldn't get, you know, cars out. We had our freeway shut down. So getting from point A to point B, I saw more pedestrians and bicyclists than I've ever seen in Asheville during that 2-week period. And trails in some cases, especially sidewalks, were really helpful to have. Build a response team and coalition around, you know, your trails in times of natural disasters, to know how to go to bat for your resource and what you can do to get things back up and running. This is an example in Western North Carolina. There's such a great coalition of partners already built that as soon as we had our natural disaster, there were teams out there, like all our volunteer trail groups, helping with recovery. And also a shout out to Piscasorga. I'm running out of time, so I think I'll turn it over to Lucy.
Thank you, Kimberly. I love watching Kim's presentation, and I wish I had known more about that maybe 5 years ago, before the hurricane. But my presentation today will talk to you about the what happened in Nashville. Can you give me a thumbs up if you see my presentation? Okay, great. Um, what happened after and what we're doing to organize ourselves to work with FEMA and our community to become a more resilient community. So I'm sure most of you know Asheville, but just in a nutshell for the sake of this presentation, I want to point out we have 2 rivers and 2 interstates that go through Asheville. The French Broad River runs north-south, and Swannanoa runs from the east to the confluence of the French Broad River. And the 26 runs generally north to south, even though they call it east-west. It doesn't make any sense, but that's what it is. And I-40 runs east-west in Asheville. And also to let you know, our existing greenways that we've been working on for more than 30 years. We, before the storm, had a little over 10 miles of greenways built. Most of them are in the river area of the River Arts District and along the Swannanoa Greenway corridor as well. But we also have a couple miles up around UNCA to the north, and we were just starting our first phase of the Swannanoa Greenway on the east side of town. We had just put up our um, erosion control when the storm hit, so our shovels didn't even get to dig in the ground. And then the hurricane hit on the 27th of September. Uh, the flooding was record-breaking. As Kim said, there was about 25 feet in height of flooding on the French Broad River and 26 feet in the Swannanoa area, which includes our Biltmore Village and the Biltmore Estate. This picture of the gatehouse of the Biltmore Estate shows the watermark. Um, it was high up there. This is a water tank. Um, Winds were also a big part in Asheville and the damage that it did. They were very strong gusts that were knocking down trees, but in addition to just regular winds, we had what were called microbursts or miniature tornadoes that really ripped out the trees in a lot of neighborhoods. And our regional trails were covered with lots of fallen trees as well. Landslides were a big issue in our area. This is taken from right outside the Asheville area on the Blue Ridge Parkway. And then within the city, the infrastructure devastation throughout the city was pretty strong. We just, in the last few months, got the last of our roads reopened. This is the intersection of Swannanoa River Road and Tunnel Road. And that took well over 6 months, I think closer to 8 months to reopen. And our interstates coming into town were also severely broken. This is I-40 just north of Asheville, and it is still only partially open. Our water system was probably our biggest devastation in the Asheville area at the time. We had several months of no water or boil advisory. The red is no water at all. The yellow and orange were the boil advisories. And then finally, right before Thanksgiving, our boil water advisory was lifted. One of the biggest things we've had to deal with since the hurricane is debris removal throughout the city. We had 960 cubic yards of debris in our waterways and rights of way and public lands, and we are just now finishing that up. It was a lot. FEMA definitely helped us with that. This McDonald's had to be raised, and they're currently rebuilding it now. And, one thing about debris removal that nobody really thinks about is the damage that it causes with the heavy equipment necessary to take things out of our way, and so that created a second wave of damage that needed to be addressed as we took the debris away. So this hurricane hit, and Asheville, in its, hubris of thinking that we were a climate change oasis, had to come to terms with what we needed to do, and we had to, get a game plan really quick. Uh, our first step was to do damage damage assessments, and then we identified our needs. We identified recovery strategies, and we are now currently in the middle area here of identifying recovery projects and prioritizing what needs to be fixed first. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Within the flooded areas, definitely our riverfronts were the ones that got hurt the worst, and we have 2 sections that have a large amount of city-owned properties that are parks. On the French Broad, we had, um, a number of parks that all, make up where the French Broad River West and the Wilma-Dykeman Greenways go through. And on the east side, we have, a very large park that number one use is soccer, but has a lot of other more. It also had a rec park with a swimming pool and the nature center and some passive recreation areas. And we were also in the process of creating one of our first natural surface trails in the area around the dog park there. But they were hit pretty hard. I'm just going to show you a few pictures. This is the Azalea Park area, which is Rec Park. This was the swimming pool here. And this was the bridge that got you into the park area, which is completely gone. The DOT has a temporary bridge that we're working out with through agreements to use to regain access into this park area. So, damage assessments throughout the whole city. My department was working very closely on the damage assessments for our greenways. And it's it is a complicated process. You have to be very thorough um, in your assessments. Can you see what I'm showing now? I can't, it's a spreadsheet. So I wanted to show you the assessments that we did. We broke them into greenways. And this was all designed so that we could hand it over to FEMA. So we had to give very good descriptions and also very general descriptions so that they could find them to do their own assessments. But our collection of assessments also had folders with our photographs in them. And I'm just going to show you a few. We had to look at every single thing based on our plans, and luckily the Wilma Dykeman was still relatively new, so we could look at our plans to see what was missing, but we had to count our trash cans and our bike parking and all of our signs and trees and the size of each one and what they were made out of, sometimes all the way down to what type of bolts were needed to give people examples of what was missing. This is where the riverbank just completely washed away. And that's probably the worst section of the Wilma Dykeman, is about 500 feet that got completely washed away. Luckily, I would say for the rest of our work that it wasn't as bad as maybe our streets were and some of our other facilities, that overall our greenways did fairly well. Um, the total amount of damage that we had was about $5 million for all of our greenways. But this is a spreadsheet that gives the details of what I was telling you about, like the 36 by 4 by 6-inch timber bicycle bollard with reflective paint and beveled edge, you know. And in these plans, we have the specifications, but we still needed to make sure that every entry had exactly what was missing. It was very time consuming. It also took place in probably the coldest months of 2024 and 25, but we were able to hand these over to FEMA, and they were happy to see the organization that the city had provided with our assessments. And I'm happy to answer any questions about this, or if you want to get in touch with me later to talk more about it. Am I back on the slide presentation here? Okay, so yeah, Kim was talking a little bit about the difference between our concrete area on our French Broad West Greenway, and then also the asphalt greenways that were along the river, the Wilma Dykeman side of the river, same river, different sides of the river. And I can definitely confirm that the concrete areas fared better. It could be a coincidence because they were on a different side of the river. But I think overall, just the concrete is definitely a better surface for resiliency than asphalt is. This map shows the areas that the two greenways were hit the hardest. And that, just like Kim was saying, was the confluence of two rivers, and also bends in the river. So this is the French Broad Park right on the bend here. This is a section of the Wilma Dykeman, the pictures that I was showing where the river bank was completely washed away is in this slight curve here. And then another section that we saw a lot of damage was underneath the 240 bridge. So the piers of the bridge were causing constraints that created more damage. So funding, there's several different funding programs, and we are working with all of them to try to recover not only public lands, but also helping business owners and private property owners with their damages as well. The FEMA public assistance funds were the ones that arrived the soonest and are the ones that bring city-owned facilities, including roads and greenways and bridges, back into shape as fast as possible. And that money has been available for us to work with. The 406 mitigation funds are ones that also help with damage recovery, but can also be used to try to build back better than it was originally. We also are working with hazard mitigation grant funding, and we're just getting started with that. Some of the grants are being awarded to individual businesses and properties in the Asheville area, but some of it is also will be used to help the city recover their parks and greenways, and also economic development. Let's see. And then there's CDBG-RDR funds. We have not started with that, so I don't have a lot of information on how this pot of funding works yet, but that will be the one that we use for housing, infrastructure, and also economic development. So working with FEMA is complicated. They have very strict processes that you need to follow, and sometimes they do not seem intuitive. And so it is very important to be working with FEMA very closely throughout the process, baby steps all the way. I can say it's been over a year and we're still working out the level of damage and their confirmation of our assessments. Um, I know that FEMA's processes have been slowed down with the current administration, but I also know that this was a fact before um, from other administrations. It's just slow, it's bogged down. It is successful, but you have to be very patient with it. Also, you have to be very clear on what you're planning to do with the money. So, we had to define our projects, define where the damage was, and then kind of create a framework around them and how we were planning to recover from them. Oops. So we had a lot of projects to do, and the first thing we did was divide them into simple projects, which was strictly focusing on restoring the infrastructure to pre-storm function with no opportunity for design or public input. And then complex projects, or we have the opportunity to take a step back and figure out what we can do to make the areas, and these are particularly park areas, to build them back better and more resilient for future disasters. I don't know what that 32, oh, 33 are the pages. Sorry. So, yes, this is a list of our simple projects. There are many of them, and this was a list that we had when we went to the International Trails Conference. This list is much longer at this time, but very straightforward. This is what we need to fix, and this is what we're going to do to get these back to the original form. And then we have created 4 complex projects. One of them is our water system, which we're still rebuilding. Another one is a municipal golf course that was along the Swananoa River that received uh, a really great whopping. But the French Broad River Park and the Azalea Park along the Swananoa River, the ones that I was showing pictures of, are 2 of our complex projects that we recently hired some consulting design teams to work with. The Sasaki team is going to be working on the French Broad River Park area, and Olin will be working on the Azalea Park, Swananoa River recovery. Incidentally, along the French Broad River, which is in the heart of the River Arts District, a group of nonprofits and property owners of the River Arts District also received funding to do a plan in that area, and they hired the same consulting team, Sasaki, that we did, or maybe we did the opposite. I think we hired Sasaki after they had already been identified by the other group. So we'll be working on the River Arts District in 2 different levels, one from economic development and private property business owners perspective with nonprofits, and then um, from our point of view, the park land that needs to be completely redeveloped. So I think I've said all of these things. We've done a fair amount of progress already. Um, I think for my final slides, I just want to make sure that everyone knows, and probably across the state, you all have been dealing with your own Helene recovery or some other disaster in the last years, but that recovery takes a really, really, really long time, and in fact, years. And we've been reaching out to other cities like New Orleans and Sandy Hook in New Jersey that have seen devastation from other hurricanes, and they're 10, 20 years in the past, and they're still recovering. It's a hard It is a hard pill to swallow how long this takes. And it will mess with your mind, I guess is the best way to say it. I like this emotional life cycle of a disaster, which um, the disaster happens and then everyone's adrenaline is high on the honeymoon phase where we're all just trying to get out in the street with our brooms and shovels and cleaning up and making sure everybody's okay, checking in with our neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. And then reality hits with disillusionment and understanding the real fact that recovery takes a really long time, a lot of effort, a lot of patience, and a lot of work throughout the community. And I guess if Asheville was anywhere in here, we're probably in one of these hills trying to reach back to our new normal. And that's all I have today. Does anyone have any questions? I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Lucy and Kimberly. That was really, really informative. I mean, speaking from someone who didn't live through it, some others on this call may have lived through it, and it's an incredibly complex situation you're having to deal with. And you sounds like you have the tools you need to, and I'm sure there are some great questions from the group here. So let's see if anyone has any questions.
Um, Hi, I'll jump in and introduce myself. I'm Julie Judkins, coordinator with the
Julie.
Great Charles State. Hi, thank you both so much. I'm like getting a better sense of the amount of work that you've done for the city, and knowing that you had your own personal losses too, probably that you're managing, and all those systems. So thank you for all your work. I I know you mentioned some really good techniques to consider in the like conversions of waterways and managing for invasive species. And I just wonder in the smaller scope of adaptive and resilient kind of management, like are there other nature-based solutions and simple things that communities might consider as they're managing trails or starting to develop smaller scale projects?
Yeah, I mean, I would mention definitely, I think a big part of resiliency design is managing stormwater on site. And if more communities and designers and I mean, a lot of it is the funding we need to do it, is to do a better job of managing water on site. You know, major events like Helene, where there's 20 to 30 inches of water, you're not managing water on site. But if you are in smaller storm events, it does really protect people downstream. So I would think that that's probably one of the biggest ones. And you know, it's not really related to design, but I just can't say, probably one of the biggest takeaways for me of seeing the recovery and how it's happening, that having a really well-established cooperative management system, which Julie, I know you know all about from the Appalachian Trail Conservancy days, but having a bunch of partners who are there to respond quickly. And there was just so many people that took up the charge, and actually so much funding available to do so. So it was really neat to see how response so quickly mobilized and got a lot of our trails open. I'd consider pretty relatively quickly. So if you also can do one other thing, it's like think through, if you went through a natural disaster, who are your partners? How are you gonna set up a strategy to have more than just you and your organization respond to it? And I think that's all about building partnerships.
Got it.
Lucy, anything you would advise on that? Just like one thing that if you could have done differently, what it would have been?
Definitely partners are a huge part of this. I'm really appreciative that the Asheville area has so many great nonprofits that we can work with. And to be honest, from our perspective, that was also very complicated to get started because we didn't want to mess up anything for FEMA's assessments. So we didn't, we were holding people back for a while from doing like the debris removal in the waterways. And there are so many people who are charged to do that and wanting to do it so badly. And we had to say, wait a second, please wait. Please wait. It didn't make any sense that we were asking people to wait, but we really had to get the assessment period done first. But now that it's loosened up, and we had all that time to be talking with our partners in the community of what we can do once we got the green light. When we were able to, it was much easier and faster work. But I wish I knew most of the things that Kimberly had said during the presentation beforehand, like years of designing and preparing for greenways would have been different. And as we move forward with greenway planning, resiliency, stream bank protection, um, enhanced stormwater on site, those kind of things are going to be looked at much more closely.
Thank you both for your presentation. If I could ask a
Hi,
question.
Luba.
Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
Hey, Kimberly.
Hey, Luba.
Just thinking about going forward and planning and designing new greenways in the Asheville region, realizing that the FEMA floodplain maps are not super accurate and probably won't even be updated for a long time.
Yeah.
What do you all think is the strategy? Like, how do we like just look at the flood level from Helene and say, okay, we're going to try to keep as many greenways out of this flood level as possible? And is that even realistic? Or do we just say, okay, well, some of the greenways will remain in the potentially flooded areas and we'll just design them so they have more permeable surfaces to kind of accommodate getting wet periodically?
Man, Luba, I wish I knew what the answers are. We're just starting to get into how to answer those because there's the logical answers or the answers that maybe our crowd here would think are the absolute right answers. And then there's private property owners with their own answers and the legal ramifications of trying to change like the UDO or the stormwater regulations, which at this point on our state level we're not even allowed to do that, right? That's illegal right now. So it's been difficult. One of the things that we will be doing with CDBG-DR funds is updating our UDO and specification manuals, which will take a couple years. So nothing is fast. Property owners are biting at the bit to get their stuff rebuilt back in the flood prone areas. It's a tough situation. It's we don't have our answers yet. We just know that we've got to take a look at it as a community and hopefully come up with the best answers that we can that are legal.
And the reality is, Lucy, right? There aren't probably like 80 to 90% of their trails in a flood zone, like in a floodway or a 100-year floodplain. So I think that's probably the case in most of America. A lot of trails are. So it's a matter of learning how to work with the dynamics of water flow so that you're backing out from areas that are going to have like a high impact, and then really learning how to build more resilient trails within the floodplain. So I think that's a challenge, and maybe technologies will evolve, but I think a lot of it's just simple, like back away from the river, get as much space as
Yeah.
you can.
But in an urban area, the difference between 10 feet from the top of bank and 30 feet from the top of bank are millions of dollars of land acquisition costs that just aren't even feasible. We would be probably wiping out most of the properties along the river if we were making a decision to push a greenway back from the riverbank. It's complicated. Like everything else in life, it's complicated.
Very.
Both.
Brian, do you have a question? Oh, okay.
No, I'm just fascinated by all the data, and we deal with the federal government a lot too with the Over Mountain Victory Trail. Nothing like what you've dealt with FEMA, but um, I was working in the Marine Corps down in New Orleans when they had their devastating storm, and thinking back to that, and then what you guys dealt with in Asheville, it's just amazing how violent a major storm can be, and the impact is it's not short term.
Yeah. Yeah, and the smaller towns outside of Asheville are in a much more precarious situation than we are with.
Very true.
I can't, imagine the capacity and the complexity of advancing these projects and recovery. Thank y'all so much for the work you're doing.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it. And it looks like we're about out of time. It's almost 1 o'clock. If there are any other questions.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if there's anything you need, I guess, I mean, I would love to say, what do you need? Resources, obviously, maybe some policies. But yeah, if there's anything else you need, let us know, like from the coalition perspective.
Thank you, Palmer.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope everyone has a great day, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.